Hello, my name is Emily, and thank you for choosing to watch my video today. We're going to be talking about the wrongful conviction of Andre Hatchett. The National Institute of Justice defines a wrongful conviction as two reasons. Firstly, the person convicted is factually innocent of the charges. Secondly, there were procedural errors that violated the convicted person's rights. Both of these factors played a role in Andre Hatchett's wrongful conviction, and we're going to dive deeper into that during this video. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
Andre Hatchett was a 25-year-old African-American man with a learning disability at the time of his arrest. Being young and black, the odds were already stacked against him, but his learning disability held him back even more in terms of defending himself against the law. Watch the rest of this video to learn about the misidentification and systematic oppression that led to Andre Hatchett's 25-year-old prison sentence for a crime he did not commit and could not have committed. At the time of the crime, Andre was living in the state of New York in a rooming house with his family. The unfortunate victim of murder, 38-year-old Nita Mae Carter, lived in the same building and interacted with Andre on a daily basis due to their closeness and proximity. 38-year-old Nita Mae Carter was found in Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, dead in a community park, laying in a crucifixion position with her ankles crossed. She had scrapes all along her body that indicated that she had been dragged through the wooded area she was found near. This would indicate that she was killed in a different location and moved to the spot she was eventually found in. So, how was Andre convicted of this crime? Well, a local criminal named Jerry Williams was arrested for unrelated crimes, but came to police claiming he had more information about the murder of Carter. This new information offered up by Jerry claimed that on the night of the murder, him and a woman nicknamed Popeye were in the park where they heard a woman scream, followed by seeing a man from a distance of 30 or 40 feet away, swinging his arm over a body laying on the ground. Initially, they told police that the man had a crutch, then later changed the statement and said that the man had no crutch. That same night, Williams identified Hatchett in a lineup. That night, Hatchett was not arrested because the police had serious doubts about Williams' credibility, rightfully so. The fact that he divulged this evidence right before being arrested points to self-fulfilling motivations. The entire case rested entirely on the fact that Williams, aka Jerry, identified Hatchett as the attacker. The district attorney filed documents showing that on the night of Williams' arrest, William had identified another man initially as the attacker. This specific information was never disclosed to Hatchett's attorney. How convenient. At the first trial, it was initially declared a mistrial because neither of Hatchett's defense attorneys used Popeye's initial identification of a different man other than Hatchett in the lineup as a defense of Hatchett. These court-appointed defense attorneys' seemingly small misstep cost Andre 25 years of his life. The unwillingness of his lawyers to put their best work forward is unfortunately an experience that is not uncommon to young black men in the criminal justice system. Court-appointed lawyers are often not up to par with self-paid-for lawyers. This is a topic we'll talk about more later in the video. At the second trial, neither of Hatchett's defense attorneys presented his medical documents. Now this is where the story gets even more interesting. At the time of the murder, Andre was on crutches after suffering a gunshot wound and physically would not have the capacity to drag a body through the woods, beat them to death, and get away without being seen. The identification of the assailant initially being identified with crutches, then the story changing, suggests that the witness may have had Hatchett in mind as someone to blame for the murder in order to get time off their sentence for the crime that they committed. Regardless of these two extremely lackluster attempts at defending Hatchett, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. This was based solely on the flimsy testimony of Williams, aka Jerry. It's hard not to think that if Andre was a different person, if he was white, if he didn't have a learning disability, and he came from a different neighborhood, would the outcomes have been different? What if people pushed just a little bit harder for the case to be looked at and to him be represented properly? It's what if questions like this that'll never be answered, but we must think that a criminal justice system needs some reform. Cases like these should have never happened, and Andre should have never been arrested. The next section of this video is going to analyze what different factors contributed to the wrongful conviction of Andre Hatchett. These factors include suppression and falsification of evidence, the prosecution and defense misconduct, eyewitness testimony, financial status of the accused, as well as confessions obtained in the absence of a lawyer, the age of the victim, the race of the victim, and the jailhouse informants used to get information about the crime. Let's talk suppression and falsification of evidence. Andre Hatchett's lawyers' inaction to request medical records, as well as their inaction to attain the original identification records that did not place him at the crime, and many more potential pieces of evidence that could have been brought to light that would convince the jury that the evidence in this trial was flimsy and shouldn't have been allowed to be submitted in the first place. Next up, we're talking financial status of the accused, as well as prosecution and defense misconduct. Not being able to afford a private firm for your case can be detrimental. As mentioned previously, Andre Hatchett lived in a rooming complex that is subsidized by the government, and it can be assumed that he was not extremely wealthy. His family's inability to afford a private firm for the case ultimately caused Andre to have to use a court-appointed lawyer that clearly did not have his best interest in mind. The inability to afford a private lawyer caused Hatchett to lose his case. If he had a lawyer that was more invested in his best interest, there could have been more done to look into his medical records, as well as disprove the eyewitness testimony that was illy conceived in an exchange for a lighter sentence. Now, let's talk about eyewitness testimony. The extremely flimsy testimony that was offered by Williams, aka Jerry, is the sole piece of evidence that Hatchett was convicted on. The court system needs to have better checks and balances so that a disabled man isn't able to be convicted of a murder based on a fully able-bodied person that has something to gain from the conviction and the information that they provided. Next up, in the factors that led up to Andre Hatchett's wrongful conviction, are the confessions obtained in the absence of a lawyer. Although Andre didn't confess, he was still interviewed in the days following the incident. Andre was happy to talk to the police in the days following, and although it was on his own free will, he should have been awarded a lawyer sooner. Because of his learning disability, the system was able to take advantage of him in a way that cost him at least a quarter of his whole life. Andre's inability to read and write put him at a huge disadvantage. Putting him into the lineup to be misidentified and arrested without some type of guardianship there was wrong, considering his disabilities and the issues he has with reading and writing. Andre's age and race were also factors in his wrongful conviction. Andre's subsequent vulnerability caused him to fall even more privy to the law, while if he was older, he may have not even been considered for the crime, as young Black people are seen to be more of a threat or a super criminal. His race also played a big factor. In 800 US jurisdictions, you are 5 times more likely to be arrested as a Black person. And in 250 jurisdictions in the US, you are 10 times more likely to be arrested as a Black person compared to your white counterparts. The final factor that I want to touch on that contributed to Andre Hatchett's wrongful conviction is the introduction of jailhouse informants to his case. Jailhouse informants are usually contacted by the authorities when they are desperate for an answer, or when the informant is desperate for some type of benefit in return. The benefit that the jailhouse informant can receive can include a reduced sentence or a reduced amount of bail. These jailhouse informants are typically the most deceitful type of informants because they would do anything in order to reduce their sentences, and their testimony is simply too unreliable. The introduction of jailhouse informants as evidence into cases has caused multiple wrongful convictions all around the world. The 1991 brutal murder of 38-year-old Nita Mae Carter was tragic and heartbreaking to say the least. But what can't be forgotten is the equally tragic and heartbreaking story of a young, disabled man being whisked away into the criminal justice system that has never had the best interest of people like him at heart. Target practices of the police, suppression and falsification of evidence, prosecution and defense misconduct, eyewitness testimony, financial status of the accused, interrogations obtained in absence of a lawyer, age of the victim in this case also being considered Mr. Hatchett, race, and jailhouse informants were all factors in the wrongful conviction of Andre Hatchett. At the end of the day, Andre Hatchett was a victim of a cruel system and a skewed society that values people based on their appearance and mental capacities. Andre is unfortunately a victim as well in this case, in addition to Carter. The flimsy eyewitness testimony that was acquired under less than preferable circumstances demonstrates the eagerness of the government to get a conviction. Andre was ultimately taken advantage of because of his disabilities and lost 25 years of his life because of this. I want to leave my audience with some questions in order to get you thinking about the true magnitude of this wrongful conviction. The first question is as follows. If Andre's skin color were different, would he have spent a day in jail? The second question is, if Andre did not have a disability that hindered his reading and writing, would he have been able to better defend himself against the law? And is it moral that the police continued to pursue him, knowing about his disability and not providing him a lawyer? The final question is, if you were in this situation, wrongfully convicted of a murder, would you have the money, time, and significant support that it requires to beat a wrongful conviction? These are all questions that I encourage my audience to reflect on. Thank you for watching this video. My name is Emily, and I hope you learned something new. If you enjoyed the video, don't hesitate to hit the like button and subscribe button and tune in to future videos.